see you this morning. Thanks for coming. My name is Brian Smith, and I teach in the Department of Biblical and Religious Studies. And I'm here this morning with my colleagues Meg Ramey, who is Assistant Professor of New Testament, and Richard Train, Associate Professor of Theology, Christian Theology, Historical Theology?
No, systematic.
Systematic?
Just Christian theology.
He's a theologian.
Christian theology.
Helps us think about God.
Systematic and dogmatic and whatever.
We would like to take some time this morning to think about wealth as it relates to the biblical text and Christian thinking about that, or perhaps more specifically what we might hear from the text about wealth, and then consider how Christians have conceived of wealth or addressed questions of wealth. I'll be talking about some of the Old Testament occurrences of this notion. Meg is going to talk about the New Testament, and Richard will help us think theologically. So a blessing or a curse, wealth in the Bible and Christian theology. So the Old Testament. I'm going to look sort of canonically, a broad picture. We're going to try to take just about 10 minutes each to do this, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions and answers afterwards, thinking together about these things that we find and questions that we might raise. So, wealth in the Old Testament, I will look across the canon. We'll first at ancestor narratives, then at the law, so-called. I like to think of it as teaching more. It's the Mosaic law. The Deuteronomistic history, which is a fancy name for the story of the nation of Israel. A little bit more on that in a moment. We'll look at some of the prophetic literature, and then the wisdom literature. And I have it in this sequence, which is slightly different from the sequence of texts in the Christian canon. This follows the sequence of texts in the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish canon. And I do that because they have the canon in the Jewish text is arranged as it was canonized. So texts that appear later in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, were later to be recognized by the community as sacred, and they were the last to achieve canonical status. The earliest chunk is what we know as the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, traditionally known. And this is important for me because if there is a trajectory or growth over time in understanding wealth, then we might see it in this arrangement of texts, as opposed to the Christian order of things, which is more driven by the chronology of the contents of the book, rather than the point at which the books became sacred for the community. So we'll start with the ancestor narratives. Abraham, of course, in Genesis 13, we hear, was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. This is just after he and Sarah have been to Egypt, and he passes Sarah off as his sister in order to save his own life, and it goes very well for him. And he leaves Egypt and... sorry about that. Oh, I have software updates available for my computer. I'll do that later. Okay. As he moves back into the Canaan, which is at that point the promised land, that we are told that he is very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. This continues with his son Isaac, after a similar story in which Isaac passes his wife Rebekah off as his sister. He is immediately blessed as a result of his faithfulness and his capacity for running a very productive livestock and operation. So the Lord blessed him, the man became rich, he prospered more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and a great household. So in the early ancestor narratives, we see wealth as an indicator of God's blessing. It's in some ways a reward for obedience, but more primarily it is an indication of God's blessing. It's less a reward as it is simply an indicator that God is blessed. If we move into the Mosaic law, when it comes to wealth, we see a lot of talk about obedience. So wealth, or at least success and prosperity, becomes a consequence of obedience. And the reverse is true, that when we are not obedient, then the law promises that things will not go well for us in farm and field and flock and home. But more particularly about wealth, instructions on loans and interest and this idea of a jubilee year in which loans are forgiven. Interest rate among the ancient Israelites was pretty low. In fact, it was at 0. They were not permitted to use interest when lending to one another. One scholar describes the economic system of the Mosaic Torah as being entirely unworkable. That lending for free, and then every 50 years, all debts are forgiven. Every 7 years, slaves are released. So there's a whole system of ideas that would prevent this, at least from our perspective, as being workable. Deuteronomy 15 is a lovely passage that one scholar describes this as the warm heart of the entire Mosaic law. The duty of the wealthy, which results, ironically perhaps, in more material blessing, is this: if there is among you anyone in need, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand willingly, lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be. Give liberally, be ungrudging when you do so. And what follows next is, if Jubilee is just around the corner, don't let that enter your mind. Don't think, man, if I lend $1,000 now, next year that's just going to go away. Don't let that enter your mind. Since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth, reminds me of of Jesus saying, you will always have the poor among you. So I command you, open your hand to the poor and the needy neighbor in your land. So wealth is a reward for obedience, but it comes with a responsibility, which then, upon obeying, in turn creates its own reward. Right? So we move now into the Deuteronomistic history, which is the story of Israel told through the lens of Deuteronomy. We call it Deuteronomistic because the narrator has a very Deuteronomistic theology. The theology of Deuteronomy informs the way we hear about the story of ancient Israel. And the question here is the wealth of kings, primarily. When Solomon asks in his great prayer for wisdom, he does not ask for wealth. He's probably got it already. David had amassed a fair bit of wealth, and there's even warnings in Samuel about what the king would bring to Israel in terms of demanding servants and taxes and horses and conscripted labor and taking slaves. So the king is a greedy sort of system, right? The monarchy it needs to consume from its own people in order to survive. The idea is that there will be payback of protection and growth, and that happens under Solomon, but he probably came to the kingdom already, inheriting a fair bit of wealth from David. But then he asks for wisdom, and God says, because you've not asked for yourself long life or riches, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, I now do according to your word. It's a great flip around, right? God says, I will do according to your word. Indeed, I give you a wise and discerning mind. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor all your life. No other king shall compare with you. And, of course, the wealth, the opulence of Solomon becomes legendary even in his own time. The Queen of Sheba comes and visits him in chapter 11 of 1 Kings and is literally breathless at all she sees, the opulence that he has. So wealth is a blessing, but what happens to Solomon, right? He ends up with a little too much stuff, particularly, the narrator tells us, wives and concubines, and these things, this opulence, leads his heart astray. So we have wealth as a continued blessing, but there's a side of ambivalence here. The narrative begins to hedge on this a little bit. And part of it's because Deuteronomy wants God to be king, not a human. If it's a pure theocracy, they won't need a monarchy. They'll have God as their king. And the temple would be the place that organized everything, which itself would require a certain amount of taxation and capital and dues to be paid. But in some ways, it's much better in God's eyes. So that's the Deuteronomistic viewpoint. But God even says to Samuel, if they're going to have a king, fine, go ahead and give them a king. It's the price that they'll have to pay. So there's a little ambivalence here. There's a push-pull. When we get to the prophets, we are perhaps reminded of sort of our classic understanding of the prophets is that rich people are bad and poor people are good. using verses out of Micah, that seems to be the message that is hammered home most frequently nowadays when we think about social justice issues and how the wealthy ought to, be concerned for neighbors. The prophetic voice of the Old Testament is brought to bear in this conversation a fair bit. But it's more complicated than that in the prophetic texts. The proper use of wealth is linked to knowing God. The misuse of wealth and the wealthy who perpetuate oppression is consistently condemned in the prophets. So wealth itself is not the issue. It's the use of wealth and the acquisition of wealth. So Jeremiah 9 says, "Do not let the wise boast in their wisdom, nor the mighty in their might, nor the wealthy in their wealth, but let those who boast, boast in this, that they understand and know me," this is God talking, "I act with kindness and justice and righteousness." So if you can imagine as scales with two pans, and in one pan are this triad of might and wisdom and wealth, and in the other pan is how God acts, kindness and justice and righteousness. These things are contrasted, and those who are righteous understand that their wealth, whether it be mental or material or physical, is subjugated to how God wants to act, which is kind and just and rightly. So the correct way to understand wealth, according to Jeremiah anyway, and in many other prophetic instances, is not that wealth itself is inherently bad, but it's the way it is used. So, and if you know God, then you use it well. And conversely, if you aren't using your wealth well, it's an indicator that you do not know God, that you actually do not know God. So a generous wealth is righteous wealth in the prophets. Now, the wisdom literature, we're getting later in the life of ancient Israel, and we start to see some theological and philosophical musings about this. So the Proverbs, of course, is a treasure trove of these kind of binary oppositions. Those who oppress the poor insult their maker, but those who are kind to the needy honor him. Now this is really interesting because it moves the use of wealth away from the Mosaic law, and it places it into more of a context of creation. A human being is not to be oppressed simply because they are a human being, not because it's against the Mosaic law. So this idea of their maker, the creator, that's broader than simply because Moses told us to. All right? The Psalms, "The wicked borrow, do not pay back, but the righteous are generous and keep giving." We don't have, this is a very wisdom-esque psalm, Psalm 37, and there are a fair number of psalms that fall into a wisdom literature category. When they address wealth, it's pretty typically along the lines of the book of Proverbs. Now, Proverbs is known for its theology of retribution. If you do well, you will be blessed, and if you do not do well, then things won't go well for you. And in the ancient world, to do well meant to live a long time and to have a certain amount of material blessing, and if you didn't do well, then you ran the risk of dying early. Things were very temporal. There wasn't much of a notion of an afterlife that provided opportunity for blessing beyond this one. So it's a very temporal perspective, and the Psalms sort of support what the Proverbs give us. In Job, we have a curious juxtaposition because the theology of retribution is being challenged in Job. And one of the primary purposes of the book of Job is to challenge the idea that if you do well, it will go well with you, right? I mean, who does better than Job? He's innocent, sinless, and he's great. And that means he's got all kinds of money and all kinds of animals, all kinds of property, and all kinds of people, and he loses all of those things in spite of his innocence. So it speaks directly against a theology of retribution. But in the end, he's proven right, and what does he get? A whole bunch of more stuff. Double what he had before, and better-looking daughters. So there's a sense in which the book of Job is at least, we can be happy, right, that it explains for us why bad things happen to decent people, or at least it grapples with that if it doesn't explain it. In the end, the epilogue, when Job gets all that stuff, that you think, man, that sort of takes the edge off the deep prophetic message that might be contained within the book of Job. But this part of wisdom literature seems to deal with his wealth as a responsibility to the fellow human. Job talks a fair bit about that in his own life. When he's trying to justify his behavior to his friends, he speaks of his own proper use of wealth. Sorry, I'm really going over it, but this is my last slide. Ecclesiastes brings us down to a very depressing end. The lover of money will not be satisfied with money, nor the lover of wealth with gain. Sweet is the sleep of laborers, whether they eat little or much, but the surfeit of the rich will not let them sleep. Now, this guy is a deeply pragmatic, somewhat cynical author who is musing on wealth and and toil and labor and how much of it is simply vanity, vanity, all is vanity. It's just a puff of breath, of vapor. This is what I've seen to be good. It's fitting to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of life God gives us. For this is our lot. Likewise, all to whom God gives wealth and possessions, and whom he enables to enjoy them, and to accept their lot and find enjoyment in their toil, this is the gift of God. So there's a gift in the sleep of the laborer, right? The surfeit of which can keep them awake, right? And if God does give you wealth, the gift may be the wealth, but the gift may also be the capacity to enjoy that wealth and not have it keep you awake at night. So it has a double-edged sword to it. So the picture of wealth in the Old Testament is complex. Theologically, if you use it well, there's nothing wrong with it. But even if you use it well, it might still keep you up at night.
Now we're going to move to the New Testament, but since time is short, we're really just going to look at the Gospels. So we're going to start with basically seeing what Jesus said. So the question is it a blessing or a curse? And what I want to start off with saying is that what Brian just showed you, the New Testament's going to diverge from that somewhat. It diverges from the ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman thought of wealth just as a reward or poverty as a punishment. So that's basically the idea, this retribution that he was talking about. And the New Testament is going to say something quite different. Ultimately, it's going to say that all our resources, including wealth, come from God. And in fact, they are given to people besides those that are just righteous. In the Sermon on the Mount, we get, the Heavenly Father gives rain and gives sun on those who are both righteous and unrighteous. So everything is seen as a blessing from God, but not necessarily just the righteous are blessed with rewards. So then it becomes whether wealth is a blessing or a curse in the New Testament really depends on how one pursues it and how one uses it. So it's not so much, I did really good and God is blessing me because I've been either obedient to God or faithful in my worship of this God or something like that, or conversely I haven't been and that's why I'm being cursed. It has more to do with how did I gain that wealth and also how did I use that wealth. So to sum up everything I'm going to say already, this is basically what you need to remember. 1, it becomes a blessing when we use it to bless others. That sounds very much like Mother Teresa, but she was onto something there. And it becomes a curse if we pursue it and hoard it only for ourselves. Okay? So I'm going to show you a few examples of this, but this is basically it. These are the 2 main points. Okay? So curse. It's said to be a curse in several different ways. These are some of the things that Jesus says about wealth. First, he says that you run the risk of just losing it. Why do you hoard these things that are either going to, moth is going to come in and eat your clothes, or rust is going to diminish any treasure that you have, or a thief could come in and steal it, right? Or, there's the real fun parable about the guy who's building all these barns to keep all of the harvest, and he doesn't have a big enough barn, so he tears it down and he builds another one, and he's like, you fool, tonight your life is going to be required from you, and then guess what? Who's going to enjoy it? Well, not you. So basically, wealth is something that's very perishable, it's very fleeting, so why are you going to invest in that? Another problem with it is that it can produce greed, and greed is often seen in the sin lists of things that are bad, not just in the Catholic list of the 7 deadly sins, but also in a lot of lists in the New Testament. There's just one example for you. And another one is that you can have lots of anxiety over not only keeping your wealth, but gaining enough wealth. And of course, probably one of the most famous passages that even if you haven't studied the Gospels, you've heard about how Jesus tells you not to worry about tomorrow, what you're going to eat, what you're going to drink. Basically, if you are a believer, you're going to trust in God, who is the one who blesses us with all of these things to provide for those things. But if we focus too much on wealth, then there's anxiety about it. This kind of reminds me a little bit of, we don't remember many sermons probably that go in one ear and out another, but one that my mom always remembered, and she would tell me, and this was even before I was born, so this is how impactful it's been passed down from the generations. She had a pastor who told the congregation that sure, you can use your money to go and buy a new boat or to buy a new car, but then what are you going to do on the weekend? You're going to spend your time taking care of the boat, and then this breaks, you got to fix that. So with the accumulation of wealth and goods, your time becomes more and more invested in it, and your anxiety over those things becomes greater and greater. So it's just something that she always used to tell us growing up. So there is anxiety that can increase. Wealth also affects our monetary dealings with other people, and this is something that Jesus brings up several times. Debt is a huge issue. Brian talked about how there's supposed to be forgiveness of debts. I think it's actually, every 7 years they would even forgive debts. So yeah, there was this concern about I'm not going to lend money in the 6th year because I'm not going to make it back. But guess what? Jesus goes a lot further than what we see in the Old Testament in many ways, and he basically says that we are to completely forgive those debts of others. Or we're in danger of not being forgiven our own debts, which is kind of scary. Like, here's one of the passages that, and by the way, could I just say, don't shoot the messenger? So if this at all sounds shocking to you, good, because it shocked Jesus' audiences the same sort of way. I mean, you don't run afoul of the Roman government and the Jewish elite by saying things that are happy and comforting, right? They're things that are challenging to people's worldviews. So when he says things like, in the Lord's Prayer, we're supposed to ask God to forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors, and then he goes on to say, for if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. So basically linking the way that we treat others with the way that God is going to treat us is kind of the inverse of the golden rule, right? We're supposed to treat others in the way that we want to be treated. But guess what? God just might treat you that same way too. And he goes on with the parable of the unmerciful servant to show how the king, this being God, right, God figure, forgives this huge debt, like 10,000 talents. And we were talking, this is more than anybody can make in a lifetime. It is many, 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 many times what Herod the Great would have had in his coffers. There's just no way anybody can have this much money, right? Not even Caesar probably had 10,000 talents. So there's no way you could pay this back, and yet the king forgives him. And so what does he do? He goes around and he grabs somebody who owes him money and throws him into debtor's prison for a very small sum. Well, guess what? The end of the story is the king finds out about this, and the same thing happens to the guy that he forgave. So you are treated the way that you treat others, and that is a common sort of theme throughout, which is, pretty scary when you look at it. Again, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just telling you what it says in the Gospels. So, wealth's effect on faith. This is another danger of it, a way that it can be a curse. So, the pursuit of wealth is kind of seen as a misuse of one's energies and affections. Your heart becomes invested, this is one way I'd like to say it, in your savings rather than in the source of your resources, in God or in God's kingdom. So we get that a lot in the Sermon on the Mount and in the Sermon on the Plain, in both of those. So why are you seeking after these things? Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these other things, these material things will be provided for you. Wealth also can divide one's loyalty from God, and I don't know any other more striking way that we see this than when Jesus flat out says you cannot serve God and wealth. And that word for wealth is mammon, which is also popular in the Hebrew Bible. It comes up a lot, but the interesting thing is there, it's just a very bland term. I mean, it just means wealth or resources. There's nothing negative about it, is what I'm trying to say. And in the Hebrew Bible, you never get any kind of command just to give everything away, or that wealth is going to be necessarily bad. It can be used poorly. But when you get to Jesus, it definitely has a negative sort of connotation here. It's something that is going to take you away from God, perhaps, divide your loyalties. It's certainly not something neutral. It's almost in the same sense like a fire. You know, it certainly can be used for good, but it gets out of hand really quickly. It's kind of the sense that we get from Jesus. In fact, and I was going to bring something, a visual demonstration here, but I left it upstairs. Wealth and the desire for it can choke out a disciple's fruitfulness. What I had for you, sadly I did not bring it, is sometimes I work on a farm in the summer, the Joshua farm in Harrisburg, and one thing I've learned from working on the farm is that some of Jesus's agrarian parables make a lot of sense. One of those is when you got weeds in the field and you don't thin out the weeds, then it looks like everything's growing great. So the top is green and lush, but when you pull up things, and I had some beets for you, the fruit is actually tiny and shriveled because it's had to compete with the weeds. And so when you get the parable of Jesus, where he's saying that, you know, we sowed this seed here and birds came along and ate it. We sowed it here on the rocky ground, right, and it didn't grow up quickly, but then it died. Or it grew up among weeds and it gets choked out. Those weeds in Jesus' parable are seen as wealth or the lure of wealth. Like that is what can actually choke out one's growth and one's fruitfulness. So again, negative connotations to wealth here. It's not just neutral. This is really, really scary. So it can even make impossible entry to the kingdom of heaven, right? How can a rich man enter the kingdom of heaven? It's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. That's a pretty challenging statement. Jesus even tells us that the kingdom of heaven is a treasure far more valuable than all of one's possessions in some of the parables. Finally, this one. Wealth and luxury in this life can even lead to eternal punishment in the next, which is interesting when you get the parable with Lazarus, right, and the rich man. That's really interesting because it doesn't really tell us that he is sent to this underworld, to this hell, because of what he did. All we're told in the story is that he was rich and he got good things in his life, and Lazarus is poor and did not. Now, towards the end of the parable, he starts to, when he's talking with Abraham, Abraham says, I'm not going to send anybody back to talk to your brothers because that's what the rich man wants to prevent them from coming here. He says, because they have the law and prophets, which would imply that maybe he hasn't been listening to the law and prophets and helping out the poor and using his wealth in a good way, and maybe that's part of why he ended up here. But, I mean, as hard as it is, that's all we're given. We're not told, you know, what he sinned or what he did wrong, just that he's wealthy and the other guy is poor. And that their eternal destinies, in some sense, are a flip of the ones right now. Does that make sense? Okay. So, what are we supposed to do then when we've got this repeated juxtaposition? And this is very different from the Old Testament, between earthly wealth and heavenly treasure, because now at this point in time we do have a concept of an afterlife, of eternal reward. And so basically you are told repeatedly by Jesus to seek first the kingdom of God before the kingdom of earth, in a sense, to invest in heavenly riches, not in material ones. But so here's the question. How does one gain, quote unquote, heavenly treasure, right? So here are a few things, and here's when it becomes a blessing. By giving it away on earth. I mean, it really is that stark. And that impractical, one might say. Again, don't shoot the messenger. So here's the question. Who is called to give it away? Well, we've got in one example the rich, like the rich young ruler. So obviously people who have wealth are called to help others to give it away. And so at first thought, I'm like, okay, well, maybe I'm not that rich, so maybe it's not me. But when we start to compare ourselves with other people in the world, we find out that we are the 1%, right? In our country, everybody here is basically the 1%. So since we can no longer think of just the person who lives next door to us as a neighbor, because Jesus makes that impossible with his teachings, right? Your neighbor is whoever, including the hated Samaritan. Yeah, it's everybody. So our neighbors are in Malaysia. Our neighbors are in Colombia. They're all around the world. So we have to think we are the wealthy. 2, it's also those who wish to be perfect. And at first you think, okay, that's fine. I'm not worrying about being perfect, so I don't really have to give everything away, right? Well, the problem is that earlier in Matthew's gospel, he has already told all disciples that you should be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. So there's this repeated call to perfection, at least in Matthew's gospel. So it's not just people who want to be, super spiritual. Then it's also people who wish to have eternal treasure, because again, investing it in this life by giving it away means that you are gaining eternal treasure. There's a flip side to it. So yeah, I think most people would probably want to do that. And now here's where it gets super, uber, duper challenging. It's those who want to be disciples of Jesus. Look at this quote. So this is Luke 14:33. He says, "So therefore none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions." So, sometimes we'll look at the rich young ruler and be like, that's just him, right? But this verse causes us pause, and we have to think maybe it has a little bit more widespread application. It's something we have to consider anyway. Here's a quote from Christopher Hayes. He's a wealth ethicist at Oxford, and I just found this challenging and also helpful. It says, "Moreover, the repeated promise that God would provide for the needs of those who seek the kingdom first suggests strongly that Jesus expected more than just a small handful of disciples to leave behind or give away their wealth. Indeed, if Jesus considered, and he does in various places, one's family and physical wholeness to be less important than the kingdom, how much less privileged ought one's wealth to be construed?" And like I said, these are pretty hard sayings. Jesus was very shocking, especially in how he approached wealth ethics. So, to whom are we called to give? And I am going to be done in a minute, I promise. Well, first, to anyone who asks and to anyone who begs from us. That's what it says in the Sermon on the Mount. There are no sort of qualifications there. Again, a pretty hard saying. Almsgiving. That was something that happened a lot in the Jewish tradition, so this is nothing new that Jesus is saying, but he continues that and reaffirms it. So almsgiving along with prayer and fasting in the Sermon on the Mount are seen as very important parts of Christian piety. They're in line with the Torah commandments, and that's something that he encourages us to continue to do. But the question then becomes, when you give alms, which, it's slightly different than the tithe, because the tithe, of course, that you're commanded to give in the Old Testament is 10% of your resources. Probably most of us have heard that before, right? And that goes first into the temple coffers. And alms are also given to the poor, to the widows, to those who are sojourning in the land, to those who are foreigners and strangers among us. But there is no 10% tithe mentioned in the New Testament. Go try to find it. Let me know if you ever find it anywhere. I would love to know. Instead, what we're told, we get examples like Zacchaeus, who gives away half of his wealth, 50% there, folks, and promises to pay back 4 times any amount that he has defrauded anyone. So that's one example. Of course, the rich young ruler is another, who Jesus tells him to give it all away. We can debate for a while whether he's being hyperbolic, but there's definitely a sense that you're going beyond the 10% tithe. And then finally, we've got examples, and here I move out of the Gospels a little into Acts. The Christians there are said to be giving all their resources and holding back nothing. Barnabas sells a field, gives it to them, and then if you go on to Ananias and Sapphira, that story, well, when they lie about the wealth that they've sold and given, they end up dropping dead over this. So wealth seems to be a pretty big deal, how one uses it in the New Testament. But there's good news, folks. Because those who do abandon their material possessions for the sake of the kingdom are promised provision. Most likely this is conceived of through the Christian community, that if we actually take care of one another, because here's one thing I think that is huge in the New Testament. You move beyond just taking care of your nuclear family or just thinking of your biological family as only family, and you think of the wider family of brothers and sisters in Christ along ideological lines rather than bloodlines. So you care for them as you would care for typically your biological family. So they're going to take care of you. And here's another thing. If you actually do invest in heavenly wealth, you're going to be rewarded, as the parable of the talents and the sheep of the goats both encourage us that there is punishment and reward based on how we handle wealth in this life and how we use monetary resources. And this again is quoting from Hayes. He says, Wealth should certainly be included prominently among the resources to be invested aggressively, that's what the parable of the talents teaches, for the sake of the kingdom. So, here's another summary for you, and I'm going to use a theologian to kind of segue into Richard's talk. John Wesley, he's one of my favorites. When he gave a sermon on wealth, he basically told us that you are to gain all you can. Now, I add to that righteously and safely, because we're told not to defraud. You know, the worker deserves his wages, so we're not to exploit other workers. And safely, John Wesley actually talks about gain all you can, but not at the expense of someone's life. And that is seen in the Old Testament a lot. Like, life seems to trump everything else. Safely, or if it's going to cause your health. So you can gain money, obviously. Jesus says the worker deserves his wages. He sends the disciples out and expects people to take care of them as they're traveling around preaching the gospel. So you do earn money. So that's great. Earn money, but in a righteous way. And then save all you can. That makes sense. These are good sorts of principles. I'd add to that unselfishly, though, because well, we can use our money and spend it on trips and boats and everything else. That's a selfish use of resources. Or we can sometimes save it in buying cheaper goods, right, that may not have been produced ethically, that might be at the expense of brothers and sisters. So we're saving money, but perhaps not in an unselfish way. And one thing that does come up in the Gospels a lot is being fearless about the future, knowing that God will provide for it, like this anxiety that is created over wealth. We're not supposed to have that in the same sort of sense. We're supposed to be fearless in our savings, not, always terrified about what's going to happen tomorrow if we lose our job or if, And then finally, last thing, and I'm getting off, I promise, give all you can. And this is obviously probably the biggest thing that we saw repeated in Jesus' teachings. And I would add to that generously. It's not just 10%. We're given examples of even more than that. And wisely. I like, there's a quote by Dorothy Sayers. You'll appreciate this. And it's in her Faustian drama that she does, where it basically says, indiscriminate charity is the device of the devil. So I think there is a sense in which you're supposed to give it wisely, to think about how you invest it, probably investing it in ways that, the Old Testament is a good example of this, because they don't just necessarily give charity that doesn't require anything. The gleaning laws, you actually have to go out in the field and work for it. So that empowers people. There's a big difference between aid and development. So anyway, there's a lot there, and I'm just going to stop talking, but at least that gives you some example of some of what we find in Jesus' teachings in the New Testament.
Good morning. What I'm doing is a really quick synopsis of a work in progress, something I hope to publish, but something that I'm a long way from having it ready to submit for publication. Tentatively entitled Pelagius Rising, and you'll see why in just a minute. During the 2012 presidential campaign, in response to the Occupy Wall Street movement, Herman Cain said, "Don't blame Wall Street, don't blame the big banks. If you don't have a job and you're not rich, blame yourself. It is not someone's fault if they succeeded, it's someone's fault if they failed." Similar vein, Rick Santorum stated, "There has always been, and hopefully I do say that, there always will be inequality." Why? Because people rise to different levels of success based on what they contribute to society and the marketplace, and that is as it should be. So what are the unspoken assumptions embedded in these statements? Well, obviously we have what David Shipler calls the Horatio Alger myth, that anyone is capable through hard work and determination of achieving economic success, which assumes that the American economic system is a fundamentally fair and just system. And Shipler adds the underside of this is that if the market is indeed a fair and final judge, economic failure is moral failure. Those who make low wages are at fault. These statements represent in public rhetoric a kind of resurgence of a kind of quasi-libertarian economic rhetoric, the celebration of unfettered markets, or as Indian economist Kaushik Basu said, we have a continuous ideological barrage of media articulation of two myths, that our markets are actually free and that our markets are fair. Now, if it sounds like I'm bashing capitalism, that's an index of how successful this rhetoric actually has been, because this is not an anti-capitalist screed. In fact, I strongly believe in the importance of free markets and a good and just society. So my target here is not the market. In fact, as I write this paper, now obviously I need greater analytical clarity on what I mean by public rhetoric to specify that further, but my target here is more of a certain mode of public rhetoric. In other words, my target is not the market per se, but a certain way of imagining the free market in the ways in which our public rhetoric articulates that. Or you might call this what has been pejoratively termed market fundamentalism by economists Fred Block and Joseph Stiglitz. The idea that markets are just inherently magic, they always work, that markets are good because they're natural, organic, they just spring from the earth, and any government regulation or intervention is artificial and distorting. So what this rhetoric does, of course, is to kind of squelch dissent. So if you're troubled by, say, exorbitant CEO pay, or what some people consider to be not inequality, but grotesque inequality, if you're troubled by how many people live below the poverty line or how many children are in poverty, this rhetoric says you're questioning the free market. And if you're raising any moral objections to this, what are you, a socialist? Do you want to pay brain surgeons and burger flippers the same amount? So in other words, it's kind of all or nothing rhetoric. One either believes in totally free, unfettered markets and raises no questions about market outcomes, or one has drifted down the slippery slope into a pernicious kind of socialism. An example of this, I have a lot of appreciation, for Dave Ramsey. I think if I lose some weight, I look a lot like him, but I've got to lose some weight. But an example of this mindset, Dave Ramsey on his radio show articulated support for an Arkansas ban on these check cashing places that charge just unbelievably predatory interest rates, usually exploiting the poor, the people who take out a quick payday loan because they're desperate. And his callers just raked him over the coals, called him a socialist, really just let him have it. And Ramsey's explanation was that he was no supporter of an intrusive state, but that capitalism needs an ethical component, and dogmatic free marketers were embracing amoral anarchy. And he said check cashing places are exploiting folks who are simply down on their luck, including many among the nation's military. And it's not a bad thing when the state erects ethical barriers to say we're going to limit markets here so that people are not exploited. But of course, his listeners were not necessarily persuaded. Now, the interesting thing, and this is where a space for good moral debate has been opened up, is that critics of what is actually happening in our economic system range from principled conservatives like Arthur Brooks to slightly left of center economists like Joseph Stiglitz to, radical voices like Chris Hedges. Ironically, we find these folks saying the same thing, that our market has been deeply, deeply skewed. I'll just give you one quick example, and then I want to get to my main point here. Obviously, the bailouts of Wall Street, in effect, the big banks knowing they were too big to fail, and in classical and neoclassical economic theory, no one's supposed to have that kind of market power to be too big to fail, but knowing they were too big to fail meant they could take just reckless risks. Knowing that if they failed, they would be bailed out by the government, so, in some sense, they privatized the gains and socialized the losses. One of the things so Arthur Brooks was asked, Arthur Brooks, principled conservative. I don't always agree with Arthur Brooks, but sometimes I do, but a very thoughtful person. He said, the Occupy Wall Street movement is right. The American economy is not fair. It's game to the powerful, to the people who have disproportionate access to the tools of government, that can turn public policies to their favor, that are too big to fail, that have access to tax carve-outs and bailouts that ordinary people do not have. Now, one of the prime examples of this, and I have multiple examples in my research, is the fact that on the local level, we have this phenomenon whereby we have this thing called relocation incentives. And it's the big box stores that play this game better than anybody. And in a book called Free Lunch by David K. Johnson, he narrates the ways in which your Cabela's, your Bass Pro Shops will promise to bring jobs and tourists to a local municipality, but they will ask for enormous tax concessions and gifts from local and state government, whether it's free land, whether it's the ability to say, we're going to ring up your sales tax at the register, but we're going to pocket that sales tax to pay for our building. Exemptions from local taxes, local state taxes, grants. In other words, all of these critics, right, center, left of center, radical, are all saying the market, what is being justified by this rhetoric as simply the just outcomes of the free market, aren't outcomes of the free market at all. We're subsidizing some players in the market, like the big Bass Pro Shops, at the expense of the local mom and pop stores who do not get all of these exemptions. What I think Bass Pro Shop extracted from the city of Buffalo is just unbelievable. In Buffalo, they received a subsidy somewhere between $90 and $130 million. This included the gift of a prime waterfront location on the mouth of the Erie Canal, freeway signs directing motorists to the Bass Pro Shop downtown, and millions moving a light rail station closer to the Bass Pro Shop. And of course, local government picked up the cost of moving that rail station, not Bass Pro Shop. And even providing a marina so potential customers could take boats for a ride. Okay, all of this to say that my critique is not of the market, but of enormous abuses of the market. So where does Pelagius and Pelagianism come in? The statements made by Cain and Santorum sound eerily reminiscent of an ancient Christian heresy. The heresy condemned as Pelagianism, some debate on whether Pelagius was actually a Pelagian, is the notion that where does sin come from? Sin comes from autonomous moral choice. Pelagius believed that Adam and Eve's sin in no way incapacitated human agency. Our will was not adversely affected by the deformation of human nature that the classical doctrine of original sin said that we inherit. In other words, for Pelagius, we have total and complete moral freedom. We can always choose to do the right thing, and we can always choose to do the wrong thing by our own power, we do not need the help of God's grace to do the wrong thing. Now, granted, reflection on the classical doctrine of original sin has been reformulated, in 20th and 21st century theology, with shift away from the idea that we inherit our sinful nature literally, to more of an emphasis on the ways in which the human race is a collective unity. We're a solidarity across generations, across cultures, within cultures, and so that the world we inherit is adversely affected by the sedimentation of sin. Sin is indeed a contagion passed from generation to generation, but this is because we're profoundly interconnected. In other words, we're social creatures. Our identity, our moral framework, our sense of right and wrong has been mediated to us before we ever make a conscious choice by our parents, by our society, by our culture. In other words, given the sedimentation of past sin, the game board on which we make our moral choices has already been set up and tilted in a decidedly negative direction. So what does that have to do with Cain and Santorum's statements? Well, only if you assume that a participant in the market possesses a freedom unimpaired by the actions of others could you come to the conclusion that we are all equally capable of achieving anything we choose to achieve. Of course, we know that not everyone has genuine equality of opportunity. David Shipler describes the destructive impact of sexual abuse on a person's economic prospects. Often, of course, economic failure is due to irresponsible moral choices, but even these choices are caught up in a destructive tapestry in which some individuals were entangled. Not everyone has access to the same educational opportunities. Or in particular, not everyone has the same connections to trusted mentors. None of this is to deny that the economic system in this nation has given tremendous opportunity to a broad array of participants. That should be celebrated. The issue is the way in which this rhetoric posits this sort of absolute freedom for every participant. Or as economist Jeffrey Sachs says, the market has some elements of fairness, but we all know that the market does not always produce good and just outcomes. The economist Joseph Schumpeter talked about capitalism's creative destruction. Some people lose their jobs through no fault of their own, just through quantum leaps of technological innovation. Some people who are wealthy have earned and have worked hard. Some people who are wealthy inherited their poverty, or even, of course, in the case of the Wall Street malfeasance, are morally blameworthy. And then one final quick point, Pelagianism is in play here in another sense. Any notion, or rather, a good theology of sin, a good theological anthropology recognizes that sin infects everything humans touch. This is kind of a restatement of the idea of depravity, right? Sin infects everything humans touch. But sin is not just something individuals do. Sin accumulates over time and gets embedded in our structures. So that if sin is universal in scope, we would expect any human institution to be distorted in part, broken in part, that there would be injustices in part. So a good theology of sin should not lull Christians to sleep to assume that any human system is natural, perfect, always innocent, always fair. A good theology of sin should lead us to have our antennas up to pick up when there are injustices and inequities and not fair. And so this rhetoric becomes insidious when it tells us that an economic system would be entirely innocent, entirely fair. And again, I'll stop there with trying to abbreviate as quickly as possible so we have a little time for discussion of all of this.
Any observations or questions from the crowd?
I have a quick question. I'm still thinking about tithing and the traditional 10%. If that's not stated in the Bible, any idea how that emerged or where the 10%?
The Old Testament,
It's in
not
the
the
Old
New Testament.
Okay.
And it's not, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not embedded in the Mosaic Law. It's developed out of Abraham's interaction with Melchizedek, right? In Genesis 14, which is a very obscure passage. But that's probably where it starts. And then it simply becomes rooted in some consciousness. I mean, I don't know that anybody went back and looking for a particular number. It probably just grew organically. 10% sounds good. You know. Before tax or after tax, that's another question. 10% of your gross or your net.
In fact, I'm wondering how much you would see the elimination of 10% in the New Testament is comparable to Jesus radicalizing all these Jewish laws. So he says, You know, it's not just adultery. If you lust, that's as bad. If you hate, that's like killing your brother. You know, 10%, that can be so easily reduced to a legalism, like honoring the Sabbath. Instead, you help your the disenfranchised every day of the week, and you give away much more than 10%.
I mean, he accuses the Pharisees for sure of tithing mint and dill and cumin. You know, these are spices that we use on our spice rack, but ignoring the weightier matters of justice and mercy. And the other New Testament writers take that and expand on it. You've got, well, this is one of my favorite passages. I didn't get to read it, but this is 1 John, of course, and it says, But if a person has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, and that person doesn't care, how can the love of God remain in him? Little children, let's not love with words or speech, but with action and truth. This is how we will know that we belong to the truth and reassure our hearts in God's presence. And then that's in John. James will say, you know, faith without works is dead, and true religion is giving to widows, giving to orphans, taking care of them. So this is a theme that runs throughout the New Testament, that you give and you give generously and you care for one another as much as you can. And Paul will say this is not so that it's to impoverish you. When he's taking out the collection for the Jerusalem church, which is apparently pretty poor at that time, saying it's not to impoverish you, but it's so that there might be a sense of fairness. That's one of the strategies that he uses, is just justice, so that when you're in need, they'll also give to you. So it's kind of this larger idea that if we put someone else's needs and we care for them as our own, right, then everybody should always be taken care of.
I tell my students that the text Meg read was 1 John 3:17, but I always read the one about laying down our lives for our brothers and sisters the way Christ did, which goes into the text you read. I always tell my students you need to know 1 John 3:16 as well as you know John 3:16.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the conundrums of philanthropy. I don't want to spend that too long because I know we're out of time, but it is the case in our system, money makes money. And in fact, I'm very thankful that there are some people out there with a lot of money who have made this event possible. This event is possible because there are some people that have kept a lot of money and made a lot of money, and then they give some of that money to this room. This room literally in one sense, but also to this room in terms of the event. And so I'm intrigued by that as an interesting problem, or a practical problem for us at Messiah College. And in some sense I think it affects our students because they have to worry about whether they're going to be able to pay $140,000 for an education at Messiah College. And so their parents work hard to board it up so that they can pay to be here. And if they're taking loans, they got to worry about whether they have got an exceptionally well-paying job to pay them off once they're done. So I'm intrigued by this notion of just giving away all that you have. We could not exist as an institution, certainly as we're currently constituted, if that was actually pursued. So I'm interested in, like, how, and I connect that to philanthropy that is larger, in some sense, like savings and planning, and so, you know, I need this much money to do this, and so forth. Things that is complicated as far as like some of all the presentations in a different way.
I mean, Richard can speak probably more to the current philanthropic ethics and theology, but the Palmers and the Highs and the climate thing is ultimately didn't afford it, right? I mean, and it may have been, in some senses, good business sense to give that money for the write-offs or for the benefits that the government provides for that, but they have choices about what they do with that money, and ultimately, the Old Testament, much of the Old Testament would say, you know, it's inherently not a bad thing. It's how you how you make use of it. And I don't know that we can say then somebody who keeps it all their lives and on their deathbed makes the grand philanthropic gift that saves their soul. I'm not heading toward that, but
it is intriguing, like someone like Bill Gates, for instance.
right.
Doing tremendous work in the world right now.
Yeah.
My gosh, he kept his money for a really long time. He's giving away some of it.
Right.
But he kept it for a very long time, and certainly not giving away all of it. But now is doing some really amazing things with the fact that he has billions of dollars.
Nothing I would have said would have critiqued those who become very successful. I mean, they're entrepreneurs, medical doctors. No, I would have no critique of those who become successful when they're doing things that are not gaming the system. I certainly would have trouble with, say, Thomas Nardelli, the former CEO of Home Depot, who gets a $210 million golden parachute after he tanked the company and tanked the stock. Some of the ways that incentives are not tied to real productivity. But you have to think through the differences between the economy under Roman occupation that Jesus is in and the economy today. So giving it away may have to take different forms that take seriously that I can't give it away all at once. If I make more money, if I invest here, I may be able to be much more strategic in what and where I give. So I would certainly affirm some of those strategies.
I'm not arguing one way or the other.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that the way our educational system in general works. An interesting phrase in Martha Nussbaum's book, Not for Profit, just really startled me when I read it. That she said, "Thank God in America we can give some private wealthy people instead of relying exclusively on the state." It's the exact opposite of what I would have expected her to say. That maybe since she's at the University of Chicago, where she relied on the millions they received from the Rockefeller family, that makes some sense for her to say that. That is interesting because our guest speaker actually said something very similar in conversation with him. Well, it's very good. We can go to wealthy donors in the United States and support the humanities through wealthy donors in a way that there's no really similar type of arrangement anywhere else in the world. I'm not endorsing those positions. I'm just saying it's an interesting problem.
It is, and we can. The last thing I would say is that we can wonder about the difference between the economics of the Roman time when these things are being said, the ancient Near Eastern culture out of which the Old Testament laws and customs come, in our own time. But I wouldn't want to lose the sort of a radical edge of those excessive statements either. There is a possibility that what we're doing here is actually completely wrong-headed. Right? I mean, we're stuck in it, but there is a possibility that what we're doing is completely wrong-headed.
I knew that from the beginning.
So, if I can say that when I already provide, what isn't wrong-headed, I'm happy to say it, and I just did.
I think there's always the challenge of taking teachings from one culture and applying them to another, of course. And so I think a good principle is that you're trying to look for the underlying spirit of the law and apply that today. And so, yes, it could be that you kept money, you made more money, but ultimately you do give it away in some sense, whether it was a deathbed donation or something. But it's not hoarding it in the same sense. But I think one thing that's interesting about the Old Testament, at least, is the system that was put in place was every family had their own ancestral land. So there was private property. That seems to be a good thing, that everybody can keep their own money and can provide for themselves. But the 50 years Jubilee, when it would always revert back to the ancestral owners, kind of leveled the playing field again. It just did. So that there was never centralized money in the hands of few, and that others were so poor. And so even when you have the tabernacle being constructed, it's people, individuals bringing their own donations in, and so it's donations from the whole community to construct something that's going to be big and huge and wonderful like this building. It's not just a few private individuals. So I'd say in some sense maybe a better system is where everybody has some, that people are empowered to work for themselves and not just receive charity, and that people can also give to one another. It doesn't always work that way, but I think the Old Testament laws were set up to
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
Pass this on.